Picture this: March 415 AD, Alexandria, Egypt. A woman is dragged from her chariot by a mob of Christian zealots, her flesh scraped from her bones with pottery shards until she dies. Her crime? Teaching mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy while refusing to bow to religious authority. This woman was Hypatia of Alexandria, arguably the most brilliant mind of her era, and someone you've probably never heard of. While most of the world descended into the Dark Ages, Alexandria remained humanity's beacon of knowledge. The great library, the museum, scholars debating geometry and mapping the stars. Hypatia stood at the center of it all, the last great mathematician of antiquity, inventor of the astrolabe, a woman who dared to think independently in a world demanding submission. But here's what's truly chilling. Her murder wasn't random religious violence. It was calculated elimination of dangerous ideas. The question isn't just what knowledge died with her, it's why this pattern of suppressing brilliant minds continues today, and what other profound wisdom has been systematically buried throughout history. You need to understand something crucial about Hypatia that history books won't tell you directly. She wasn't just brilliant, she was intellectually dangerous. In an age when women were expected to remain silent ornaments in their homes, Hypatia stood before packed lecture halls filled with men, dissecting the mysteries of mathematics and astronomy with a precision that left seasoned scholars speechless. Picture this scene: a woman in 4th century Alexandria, confidently drawing geometric figures, while explaining the intricate curves of conic sections to students who had traveled hundreds of miles just to hear her speak. This wasn't just unusual, it was revolutionary. Every time she opened her mouth to teach, she shattered another expectation about what women could accomplish. Her mathematical genius went far beyond what most people realize. When she tackled Apollonius's complex treatise on conic sections, work that dealt with ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas, she didn't just study it, she rewrote it, making the concepts clearer and more accessible. These weren't abstract mathematical exercises. Conic sections would later become fundamental to understanding planetary orbits, artillery trajectories, and even the design of satellite dishes. Hypatia was unlocking secrets of the universe that wouldn't be fully appreciated for another 1,000 years. But her most threatening achievement was improving the astrolabe. Think of this device as the ancient world's computer, a sophisticated instrument that could predict the positions of stars and planets, calculate the time of day or night, and even determine your latitude. When Hypatia enhanced its design, she was essentially putting astronomical power into the hands of ordinary people. No longer did you need to rely on priests or official astronomers to understand celestial movements. You could calculate these things yourself. She also invented the hydrometer, an elegant device for measuring the density of liquids. While this might sound mundane, it was actually revolutionary for trade, medicine, and scientific research. Merchants could test the purity of oils and wines, physicians could analyze bodily fluids more accurately, and researchers could conduct experiments with unprecedented precision. Here's what made Hypatia truly dangerous to the authorities. She taught that mathematics revealed the fundamental structure of reality itself. In her school, students learned that the universe operated according to rational, discoverable principles. You didn't need divine revelation or priestly interpretation to understand how the world worked. You needed observation, logic, and mathematical reasoning. This was heretical thinking. Christian authorities insisted that divine mystery, not human understanding, should guide people's lives. They preached that faith trumped reason, that questioning led to damnation, and that certain knowledge was reserved for God alone. Hypatia's entire approach demolished these ideas. She demonstrated daily that human minds could penetrate the deepest secrets of creation through careful study and logical thinking. Her school became a magnet for free thinkers across the Roman Empire. Students arrived from distant provinces, hungry for knowledge that couldn't be found anywhere else. She taught them to question everything, not just mathematical problems, but social assumptions, political structures, and religious doctrines. Her classroom discussions ranged from geometric proofs to ethical philosophy, from astronomical observations to political theory. What really alarmed the power structure was how she lived her personal life. Hypatia remained celibate throughout her life, but not from religious conviction. She famously declared that she was married to philosophy itself. When one persistent suitor wouldn't accept her rejection, she reportedly showed him a bloodied cloth from her menstrual cycle, saying, This is what you are in love with, and it is not beautiful. She chose intellectual pursuit over traditional female roles, demonstrating that women could find fulfillment through scholarship rather than marriage and motherhood. This wasn't just personal preference, it was a direct challenge to the social order. If women could achieve greatness through learning rather than childbearing, what did that say about the entire structure of society? If the most brilliant mind in Alexandria belonged to a woman who refused to submit to male authority, what did that mean for other women? The specific mathematical techniques and philosophical methods she developed were deliberately obscured by later Christian scholars who recognized their power to transform how people thought about knowledge itself. Some of these approaches remain hidden in fragments and coded references, too revolutionary even for modern academic discourse to fully embrace. But Hypatia's influence extended far beyond her classroom. As the daughter of Theon, the last director of the famous Library of Alexandria, she had grown up surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries. She understood that knowledge was power, and she wasn't interested in hoarding that power. She wanted to democratize it. Her political influence was equally threatening. Government officials regularly consulted her on important decisions. She advised the Roman prefect Orestes, helping shape policies that affected thousands of lives. In a world where political power was supposed to flow through official channels controlled by men, here was a woman whose intellectual authority trumped traditional hierarchies. The combination was explosive: mathematical genius, philosophical innovation, political influence, and social defiance, all embodied in one person who happened to be female. She represented everything the emerging Christian power structure needed to suppress: independent thinking, female authority, rational inquiry, and intellectual freedom. Her students didn't just learn mathematics and astronomy. They absorbed a complete worldview that celebrated human potential over divine mystery, reason over faith, and individual inquiry over institutional authority. They left Alexandria carrying ideas that could transform entire communities, spreading intellectual rebellion across the Roman world. This is why her murder was so carefully orchestrated. The authorities didn't just want to silence one troublesome teacher. They wanted to send a message that would echo through history. This is what happens when knowledge becomes too dangerous, when teaching becomes too transformative, when a single person's ideas threaten the foundations of power itself. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the proof that human beings are capable of understanding their world through reason and observation. Hypatia's mathematical work demonstrated that the universe operates according to principles we can discover and comprehend. Her teaching methods showed that knowledge grows through questioning, not blind acceptance. Her very existence proved that brilliance knows no gender, that wisdom respects no artificial boundaries. Her teachings offered more than academic knowledge. They provided a blueprint for human liberation through intellectual courage. And that blueprint was so powerful, so threatening to established authority, that they're still trying to bury it 15 centuries later. The mathematics and astronomy were just the beginning. What really made Hypatia dangerous to the Christian authorities wasn't her ability to calculate planetary orbits or solve geometric theorems. It was the philosophical framework she taught alongside those calculations, a way of understanding reality that threatened to make every priest, every bishop, every religious authority completely obsolete. Hypatia was the last great teacher of Neoplatonism, a philosophical school that had been developing for centuries before her birth. But she wasn't just preserving dusty academic theories. She was teaching a living system of thought that gave ordinary people direct access to truth and divine knowledge without needing anyone's permission. Think about what this meant in her world. The Christian Church was rapidly consolidating power across the Roman Empire, building its authority on a simple premise: you need us to reach God. You need our priests to interpret Scripture, our bishops to define doctrine, our rituals to achieve salvation. The Church positioned itself as the essential middleman between humanity and the divine. Neoplatonism said exactly the opposite. This philosophical tradition, which synthesized the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle, and other ancient thinkers, taught that every human being contains a divine spark, what they called the nous, or divine intellect. Through reason, contemplation, and philosophical inquiry, any person could achieve direct knowledge of ultimate reality. No priests required, no church hierarchy needed, no religious authorities at all. When Hypatia stood before her students in Alexandria's great library, she wasn't just teaching them to think, she was teaching them to become their own spiritual authorities. She showed them how the material world we experience through our senses is merely a reflection, a shadow, as Plato had called it, of higher realities that exist beyond physical form. These higher realms weren't mysterious or unknowable. They could be accessed through mathematical reasoning and philosophical contemplation. Here's where her teaching became truly revolutionary. Hypatia demonstrated that geometric principles weren't just abstract concepts. They were windows into cosmic truth. When students learned that the same mathematical relationships governing musical harmony also appeared in planetary motions, they weren't just memorizing facts. They were discovering that the universe operates according to rational principles that human minds can comprehend directly. She taught them that astronomical observations revealed an underlying harmony beneath apparent chaos. The seemingly irregular movements of planets, when understood through mathematical analysis, showed perfect order. This wasn't just scientific education, it was spiritual training. Students learned to see past surface confusion, to discover the rational structure underlying all existence. But Hypatia's most dangerous teaching method was dialogue itself. Instead of requiring students to memorize religious dogma or accept revealed truth from authorities, she engaged them in questioning. Her classroom operated through what philosophers call the Socratic method, asking probing questions that forced students to examine their assumptions, seek evidence for their beliefs, and think through problems independently. Picture a typical session with Hypatia. A student might ask about the nature of the soul. Rather than quoting scripture or citing religious authorities, she would ask, what evidence do we have for the soul's existence? How might we investigate its properties through reason? What can mathematical principles tell us about non-material reality? Students learn to construct arguments, evaluate evidence, and reach conclusions through their own intellectual effort. This approach created something the Christian authorities found terrifying: people who thought for themselves. Students didn't just learn astronomy or mathematics, they developed intellectual autonomy. They became comfortable questioning received wisdom, examining claims critically, and trusting their own rational faculties to discover truth. The political implications were explosive. If people can discover truth independently through reason and observation, why do they need rulers to tell them what to think? If individuals can access divine knowledge directly, why should they submit to religious hierarchies? Hypatia's philosophy naturally promoted intellectual independence, which inevitably leads to political independence. Her students proved this connection. Many became leaders in Alexandria's civic life, applying Neoplatonic principles to governance and social organization. They promoted rational decision-making over traditional authority, evidence-based policies over religious doctrine, and inclusive dialogue over top-down command. Some challenged corruption in both religious and secular institutions, using the critical thinking skills Hypatia had taught them. One of her students, Synesius of Cyrene, became a bishop but continued applying Neoplatonic methods to theological questions, much to the consternation of church authorities. He insisted on rational investigation of religious claims and maintained that philosophical inquiry could reveal divine truth more reliably than scriptural interpretation. Another student, Orestes, served as Alexandria's prefect and consistently resisted pressure from Christian leaders to suppress philosophical education. The Christian authorities recognized exactly what was happening. Hypatia wasn't just teaching alternative ideas, she was teaching people to think in ways that made religious authority irrelevant. Her students were becoming intellectually self-sufficient, spiritually autonomous, and politically independent. They were living proof that human beings could flourish through reason and philosophical inquiry without submitting to religious control. Sound familiar? The same dynamic operates today. Modern institutions, whether educational, media, or political, often discourage the kind of critical thinking Hypatia promoted. We're encouraged to accept expert opinion rather than investigate evidence ourselves, to trust authority rather than develop independent judgment, to consume information rather than engage in philosophical inquiry. But here's what most people don't realize. Hypatia's philosophical methods weren't entirely lost when she was murdered. They were preserved in secret traditions that continued influencing history in ways that rarely make it into standard textbooks. Islamic philosophers like al-Kindi and al-Farabi preserved and developed Neoplatonic ideas during the medieval period. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola revived these traditions in 15th century Europe. Even the scientific revolution drew heavily on Neoplatonic assumptions about the mathematical structure of reality. The underground stream of Hypatia's teaching continues flowing today. whenever someone chooses rational inquiry over received wisdom, whenever someone trusts their own capacity to discover truth, whenever someone refuses to surrender their intellectual autonomy to any authority, religious, political, or otherwise. Her philosophy remains as threatening now as it was in 415 AD, because it offers something every power structure fears: the possibility that ordinary people can think for themselves. The year was 415 CE, and Alexandria's cobblestones ran red with the blood of the ancient world's greatest female scholar. They dragged Hypatia from her chariot like a common criminal, this woman who had commanded the respect of emperors and philosophers alike. The mob, whipped into religious frenzy by a reader named Peter, stripped her naked in the street. Then came the oyster shells, sharp, jagged instruments that scraped the flesh from her bones while she still drew breath. They wanted to make an example of her, to show what happened to those who dared challenge the new Christian order with reason and mathematics. But here's what the church fathers who orchestrated this brutal murder never anticipated: ideas don't die with flesh. While they celebrated the silencing of Alexandria's most dangerous voice, Hypatia's intellectual legacy was already spreading through channels they couldn't see or control. You have to understand, Hypatia's students weren't casual attendees of philosophical lectures. These were some of the most powerful and influential minds of the late Roman Empire, and they recognized exactly what was at stake when their teacher fell. Synesius of Cyrene, who would later become a bishop, had spent years corresponding with Hypatia about everything from astrolabes to the nature of divine consciousness. Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, had been her student and ally. These weren't people who would simply shrug their shoulders and move on after witnessing such an atrocity. In the months following Hypatia's murder, something remarkable happened. Her surviving students began operating like an underground resistance movement. They understood that preserving her teachings meant more than just hiding scrolls in dusty libraries. They were safeguarding an entire way of thinking that threatened authoritarian control at its very foundation. Think about the position these scholars found themselves in. The Christian authorities had just demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, what happened to those who promoted rational inquiry over blind faith. So how do you preserve dangerous knowledge when the very act of teaching it could get you killed? They got creative. Brilliantly, dangerously creative. Synesius developed what we might recognize today as a sophisticated coding system. In his letters and treatises, mathematical concepts were disguised as theological discussions. References to Hypatia's geometric insights were embedded in seemingly pious meditations on divine proportion. Her revolutionary approaches to astronomical calculation were hidden within discussions of celestial hierarchy that would pass muster with church censors. But the network went deeper than just coded texts. Orestes, using his political position, began commissioning architectural projects that incorporated Hypatia's mathematical principles. The geometric relationships she had discovered were literally built into the stones of buildings across the Eastern Empire. Visitors today can still trace these proportions in structures from Constantinople to Antioch, never realizing they're looking at a mathematical rebellion frozen in marble and brick. Other students took different approaches. Some joined monasteries, not out of religious conviction, but because these institutions offered the only safe spaces for preserving and copying manuscripts. Imagine the irony: Hypatia's Neoplatonic teachings being secretly maintained by monks who publicly condemned everything she represented. The most fascinating aspect of this preservation network was how it adapted and evolved. As Christianity consolidated its power and began systematically destroying pagan texts, Hypatia's followers developed increasingly sophisticated methods of knowledge transmission. They created what we might call philosophical sleeper cells, small groups of scholars who maintained oral traditions, passing down her methods for integrating mathematics, astronomy, and consciousness studies through carefully guarded master-student relationships. When the Dark Ages descended on Europe and Christian authorities were burning libraries with gleeful abandon, something extraordinary was happening in Baghdad. Islamic scholars at the House of Wisdom weren't just preserving Greek mathematical texts, they were actively building upon Hypatia's work. Al-Kindi, often called the first Islamic philosopher, developed approaches to mathematics and metaphysics that bore unmistakable traces of her influence. The great mathematician Al-Khwarizmi's algebraic innovations contained geometric insights that can be traced directly back to techniques she had pioneered. This wasn't coincidence. We now know that several of Hypatia's students had fled to Persia and the expanding Islamic world, carrying with them not just her texts but her living methodologies. While European Christians were declaring mathematics to be the devil's work, Islamic scholars were preserving and expanding the very knowledge traditions that had made Hypatia so dangerous to religious authorities. The Renaissance didn't happen in a vacuum. When scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola began rediscovering Neoplatonic texts in the 15th century, they weren't just stumbling upon dusty manuscripts. They were accessing a carefully maintained underground tradition that had preserved not just Hypatia's ideas, but her revolutionary approach to integrating rational inquiry with spiritual exploration. Ficino's translations of Plotinus and other Neoplatonic texts contained marginal notes and commentaries that scholars now recognize as bearing Hypatia's distinctive intellectual fingerprints. Her methods for using mathematical relationships to understand consciousness were embedded in Hermetic traditions that had survived centuries of persecution by masquerading as mystical rather than scientific inquiry. But here's where this gets really fascinating. Certain mystery schools and philosophical societies maintained oral traditions that can be traced, through careful historical detective work, directly back to her influence. The emphasis on mathematical mysticism that you find in groups like the later Rosicrucians, the integration of geometric principles with consciousness exploration that characterizes certain Hermetic traditions, these bear striking similarities to approaches we know Hypatia pioneered. Even today, if you know what to look for, you can trace her influence in the most cutting-edge fields of human inquiry. Quantum physicists studying the mathematical relationships underlying reality are using methodologies that echo her integration of numerical analysis with metaphysical investigation. Consciousness researchers exploring the geometric patterns of neural networks are walking paths she first mapped 15 centuries ago. Systems theorists studying the mathematical principles that govern complex interactions are applying frameworks she would have recognized immediately. The secret network that preserved Hypatia's knowledge reveals something profound about how truth survives even the most determined efforts to destroy it. Ideas that threaten power structures don't disappear when their advocates are murdered. They adapt, evolve, and find new channels of transmission. They embed themselves in art, architecture, and seemingly unrelated fields of study. They survive in the DNA of intellectual traditions that appear to have nothing to do with their original source. Understanding this hidden lineage of knowledge transmission shows us that the battle between rational inquiry and authoritarian control isn't just ancient history. It's a pattern that repeats throughout human civilization, and recognizing how previous generations preserved dangerous truths can teach us how to protect the revolutionary ideas of our own time. Here's the thing that will completely change how you see mathematics. Hypatia didn't just teach numbers and shapes. She revealed that mathematical principles are the actual blueprints of reality itself. The calculations she performed weren't academic exercises. They were keys that unlocked the fundamental patterns governing everything from the movement of planets to the structure of human consciousness. When Hypatia worked with conic sections, she wasn't just drawing circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas on papyrus. She was showing her students the basic architectural forms that nature uses to construct the universe. Think about this. Every planetary orbit follows an elliptical path. Every parabolic mirror focuses light at a precise point according to mathematical law. But here's what makes this revolutionary. Hypatia demonstrated that these same patterns operate within human psychology and social structures. She would take a student through the mathematics of an ellipse, showing how two focal points create the curve. Then she'd reveal how human decision-making follows identical patterns. We're constantly balancing between two focal points of desire and consequence, creating the elliptical path of our choices. The mathematics wasn't separate from life, it was the hidden grammar of existence itself. Her work with the astrolabe proves this point perfectly. Most people think she just improved an astronomical instrument for navigation, but examine what she actually accomplished. Hypatia refined the astrolabe into something far more sophisticated, a device that could perform complex astronomical calculations with unprecedented accuracy. Yet the deeper significance lies in what this represented. She was teaching people to navigate by rational principles rather than superstition. Before Hypatia's innovations, people relied on priests and oracles to interpret celestial movements. She handed them a tool that made every person capable of understanding and predicting natural phenomena through reason alone. The astrolabe became a symbol of human intellectual independence. No wonder the authorities felt threatened. She was literally putting the power of prediction and navigation directly into individual hands. But let's dig deeper into her most dangerous discovery: proportional relationships and harmonic ratios. Hypatia connected mathematical harmony to musical harmony to cosmic harmony, revealing that the universe operates according to comprehensible patterns. This wasn't theoretical philosophy. It was a practical method for aligning human life with natural law. She would demonstrate how the same ratios that create pleasing musical intervals also appear in the orbital periods of planets. The mathematical relationship between a perfect fifth in music, a 3:2 ratio, shows up in countless natural phenomena. Plant growth follows these proportions. The human body reflects these ratios. Even the structure of crystals conforms to these harmonic relationships. What made this so revolutionary was her teaching method. She showed students that by understanding these mathematical harmonies, they could recognize when their own lives were in or out of alignment with natural principles. A society built on mathematical harmony would be just and stable. A life lived according to these proportions would be balanced and fulfilling. Hypatia also taught something that modern education deliberately avoids. Numbers aren't just quantities, they're qualities. Each number carries specific meanings and powers. She understood what we might now call sacred geometry, how certain mathematical relationships appear throughout nature and can be used to understand everything from plant growth to human consciousness. Take the golden ratio, approximately 1.618. Hypatia showed how this proportion appears in flower petals, seashells, and galaxy spirals. But more importantly, she demonstrated that human faces and bodies, considered most beautiful, conform to golden ratio proportions. The mathematics wasn't imposed on nature. It was nature's own organizing principle, visible to anyone who learned to see it. Her approach to teaching mathematics developed both logical reasoning and intuitive perception simultaneously. Students learned to perform calculations, but they also developed the ability to perceive patterns and connections that escape ordinary observation. This created balanced minds capable of independent thought, exactly what authoritarian systems fear most. Modern science has validated Hypatia's insights in ways that would astound her contemporaries. Fractal geometry reveals how simple mathematical rules create infinite complexity in natural forms. Chaos theory shows how mathematical patterns emerge from apparent randomness. Quantum mechanics demonstrates that mathematical relationships underlie physical reality at the most fundamental level. But here's what's truly remarkable. Hypatia was teaching these principles 15 centuries before our modern discoveries. She understood that mathematical thinking develops intuitive abilities. Students who mastered her methods could perceive the mathematical structures underlying seemingly unrelated phenomena. Consider how different your education might have been if you'd learned mathematics as Hypatia taught it. Instead of memorizing formulas for tests, you would have discovered the elegant patterns that connect music to astronomy, geometry to psychology, numbers to the deepest structures of reality itself. Her mathematical approaches contained keys to unlocking human potential that modern educational systems deliberately avoid teaching. Why? Because a population that understands the mathematical nature of reality becomes impossible to manipulate through superstition, fear, or false authority. When you understand that the same mathematical laws governing planetary motion also govern social dynamics, you can predict and influence outcomes through rational analysis rather than emotional reaction. When you recognize the harmonic ratios that create stability in music and nature, you can apply these same principles to create harmony in relationships and communities. This is why Hypatia's mathematical teachings were so dangerous to those in power. She wasn't just teaching calculation, she was teaching people to see through the mathematical structures of reality itself, making them immune to deception and capable of creating genuine order based on natural law rather than arbitrary authority. The mathematical keys Hypatia discovered are still available to anyone willing to look beyond the surface of numbers and see the profound patterns that connect all existence. Alexandria, 415 AD. The greatest library in the ancient world still stands, but its halls echo with whispers of conspiracy. The Roman Empire is hemorrhaging its intellectual soul, trading centuries of accumulated wisdom for the rigid certainty of a new Christian order. And at the center of this transformation sits one woman whose very existence threatens everything the new power structure is trying to build. You need to understand something crucial about Hypatia's murder. It wasn't the spontaneous act of religious fanatics that history textbooks describe. This was a calculated political assassination, planned and executed with the precision of a military operation. The mob that dragged her from her chariot didn't just happen to find her that day. They were waiting. Cyril of Alexandria wasn't just another bishop drunk on religious fervor. This man was a master politician who understood power dynamics better than most Roman senators. He'd been watching Hypatia's influence grow for years, and he recognized something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Her students weren't just learning mathematics and astronomy, they were learning to think independently. Worse yet, they were taking these principles of rational inquiry and applying them to governance throughout the empire. Think about what this meant in practical terms. When Hypatia taught her students to question assumptions and follow evidence to logical conclusions, she was creating a generation of leaders who would naturally resist authoritarian control. These weren't just abstract philosophical discussions. Her former students were serving as governors, advisors, and administrators across the Roman world. They were implementing policies based on reason rather than religious decree. And this was creating a parallel power structure that threatened everything Cyril was working to achieve. But here's where the conspiracy gets really interesting. Hypatia's relationship with Orestes, the Roman prefect of Alexandria, wasn't just friendship, it was a direct challenge to the church's political ambitions. Orestes regularly consulted with her on matters of civil administration, and she was advising him to maintain the separation between religious and secular authority that had characterized Roman governance for centuries. Cyril saw this clearly. Every time Orestes made a decision based on Hypatia's counsel rather than church doctrine, it demonstrated that rational thought could compete with religious authority as a basis for leadership. This wasn't just about theological disagreements, it was about who would control the future direction of civilization itself. The timing of her assassination reveals the calculated nature of this conspiracy. Lent, 415 AD, religious fervor was at its annual peak, making it easy to disguise political murder as righteous religious action. Cyril's followers had been stirring up anti-pagan sentiment for months, creating the perfect cover for what was essentially a state-sponsored elimination of political opposition. But the method of her killing tells us everything we need to know about the message being sent. They didn't just want Hypatia dead, they wanted her death to terrorize anyone else who might challenge church authority. Scraping her flesh with oyster shells wasn't chosen for efficiency. It was chosen for psychological impact. The brutality was the point. They wanted every philosopher, every teacher, every independent thinker in the empire to understand exactly what would happen to them if they continued promoting rational inquiry over religious obedience. And it worked exactly as intended. Within a generation, Alexandria's role as the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world was finished. Scholars fled, libraries were abandoned, and the systematic pursuit of knowledge that had characterized Greek and Roman civilization for nearly 1,000 years came to an abrupt end in most of the empire. This pattern of eliminating dangerous thinkers isn't some ancient historical curiosity. It's a playbook that's been used repeatedly throughout history whenever established power structures feel threatened by independent thought. Galileo faced the Inquisition for promoting heliocentrism not because it contradicted scripture, but because it demonstrated that church authorities could be wrong about fundamental questions. The same dynamic played out during the witch trials, when women with knowledge of herbal medicine and natural healing were systematically eliminated because their effectiveness undermined the church's monopoly on addressing human suffering. Even in modern times, we see similar tactics deployed against inconvenient voices. Scientists who challenge pharmaceutical industry claims find their funding cut and their careers destroyed. Economists who question central banking policies are marginalized from academic institutions. Journalists who investigate government corruption face harassment, legal threats, and worse. The methods have evolved, but the underlying strategy remains identical: eliminate the messenger to suppress the message. What makes Hypatia's assassination particularly significant is how perfectly it illustrates the relationship between knowledge and power. She wasn't killed because she was pagan. Plenty of pagans converted and lived peacefully under Christian rule. She was killed because she represented something far more dangerous: the idea that human beings could use reason and evidence to understand reality without requiring permission from religious or political authorities. This is why understanding her story matters so much today. When you see attempts to discredit scientific research, to defund educational institutions, or to silence voices that challenge official narratives, you're witnessing the same fundamental dynamic that led to Hypatia's murder. The specific ideologies change, but the underlying fear remains constant. Independent thinking threatens authoritarian control. Recognizing these patterns is your first line of defense against intellectual manipulation. When you understand how power structures have historically suppressed inconvenient knowledge, you become much better at identifying when similar tactics are being used in your own time. The goal isn't to make you paranoid about every institution, but to help you develop the same kind of intellectual independence that made Hypatia so dangerous to her enemies. Because here's what they didn't count on: killing the teacher doesn't always kill the teaching. Despite their best efforts to bury her insights, Hypatia's approach to learning and thinking survived, passed down through hidden networks and preserved by people who understood its value. And now, 15 centuries later, we're rediscovering why her ideas were considered so threatening in the first place. The most tragic intellectual crime in human history wasn't just the murder of Hypatia, it was the systematic destruction of her revolutionary writings that followed. When the Christian mob dragged her from her chariot and brutally killed her, they didn't stop there. They methodically hunted down her manuscripts, her commentaries, her original mathematical proofs, and burned them all. What we lost in those flames was nothing short of a complete blueprint for understanding reality through mathematical principles. But here's what those who orchestrated this destruction didn't count on: ideas this powerful leave traces. Like archaeologists piecing together ancient civilizations from pottery fragments, we can reconstruct Hypatia's revolutionary insights from the scattered references her students left behind, from later mathematicians who quoted her work, and from the careful analysis of texts that survived because they seemed harmless to religious authorities. Let me show you what we've uncovered, and why these ideas were considered so dangerous they had to be completely erased from history. Start with her commentary on Apollonius's work on conic sections, circles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas. Most scholars treated this as pure geometry, but Hypatia saw something that wouldn't be formally recognized until centuries later. She understood that these seemingly different shapes were actually expressions of the same underlying principle. Change the angle of a plane cutting through a cone, and you get different curves, but they're all manifestations of the same geometric relationship. Her students' notes reveal that she used this mathematical insight to teach something far more profound about the nature of reality itself. She showed them that what appears to be diversity and opposition in the world, light and dark, order and chaos, growth and decay, are actually different expressions of deeper unifying principles. This wasn't mystical speculation. This was rigorous mathematical thinking applied to understanding existence itself. Think about how revolutionary this was. While religious authorities were teaching that the world was divided into sacred and profane, good and evil, with rigid boundaries between categories, Hypatia was demonstrating mathematically that apparent opposites often emerge from the same source. She was teaching her students to look for the underlying unity behind surface diversity. Her work on Ptolemy's astronomical texts reveals even more dangerous thinking. She wasn't just explaining how planets moved, she was uncovering what we now call the principle of mathematical universality, the idea that the same mathematical laws governing celestial motions also applied to earthly phenomena. Her students recorded that she would demonstrate how the same geometric principles describing planetary orbits could be found in the growth patterns of plants, the flow of water, and even human behavior patterns. This was intellectual dynamite. If the same mathematical laws governed both heaven and earth, then the boundary between divine and mundane collapsed. More threatening still, it meant that humans could understand divine patterns through reason and observation, rather than requiring priestly interpretation. She was essentially teaching that mathematics was a direct path to comprehending the fundamental structure of reality. But Hypatia went even further. From fragmentary references in later texts, we can reconstruct what she taught about what we'd now call systems thinking. She showed students that individual elements, whether numbers in an equation, planets in the solar system, or people in a society, only make complete sense when understood as parts of larger wholes. She taught them to identify recurring patterns that appear at different scales of organization. Her students learned to recognize that the same mathematical relationships governing planetary orbits also appeared in human psychological cycles and social dynamics. This wasn't metaphorical thinking. She was identifying actual structural similarities that could be analyzed and predicted using mathematical tools. She was teaching practical applied mathematics for understanding and navigating complex human situations. What's particularly fascinating is how she approached what modern science calls emergence, the way complex behaviors arise from simple underlying rules. Her students' accounts describe exercises where she would show them how basic geometric principles, when applied iteratively, could generate incredibly complex and beautiful patterns. She taught them that understanding these generative principles allowed both prediction and influence of outcomes. This practical application extended to her revolutionary approach to logic and rhetoric. Unlike the sophists who taught argumentation as a tool for winning debates regardless of truth, Hypatia developed methods for distinguishing valid from invalid reasoning that her students applied to everything from personal decisions to evaluating political policies. She created systematic approaches for identifying logical fallacies, recognizing emotional manipulation, and constructing sound arguments based on evidence. Perhaps most remarkably, we can reconstruct from student testimonies her teachings on consciousness and perception. She taught that human awareness operates simultaneously on multiple levels: immediate sensory experience, pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and what she called mathematical intuition. She developed specific practices for training each level of awareness and integrating them into more accurate perception of reality. Her methods combined what we might now recognize as mindfulness techniques with rigorous intellectual training. Students learned to observe their own thinking processes, recognize when emotions were distorting their reasoning, and develop what she called geometric thinking, the ability to perceive underlying structural relationships directly. These weren't just academic exercises. Her students reported that these practices dramatically improved their ability to make effective decisions, understand complex situations, and influence outcomes in their personal and professional lives. She was teaching applied cognitive science 15 centuries before the field officially existed. What makes this reconstruction even more remarkable is how closely Hypatia's insights align with cutting-edge discoveries in modern cognitive science, complexity theory, and consciousness research. Her understanding of how mathematical thinking develops higher-order perception matches what neuroscientists are discovering about how mathematical training literally rewires the brain for pattern recognition. Her insights about emergence and systems thinking anticipated principles that wouldn't be formally developed until the 20th century. Her methods for training awareness and integrating different levels of consciousness parallel techniques being validated today in contemplative neuroscience research. This isn't coincidental validation. It's evidence that Hypatia had discovered fundamental principles about how consciousness, mathematics, and reality interact. Principles so powerful and practical that they had to be completely suppressed to maintain existing power structures. Recovering these lost teachings isn't just historical curiosity. These are practical tools for understanding and navigating reality that were deliberately buried because they made individuals too independent, too capable of thinking for themselves, too difficult to control. The question is, what would our world look like if these insights had never been suppressed? And more importantly, what becomes possible when we reclaim them now? The story of Hypatia becomes infinitely more profound when you understand that she wasn't simply an exceptional mathematician who happened to live in ancient Alexandria. She was something far more significant, a keeper of mysteries that stretched back thousands of years before her time, an initiate in wisdom traditions that connected the deepest insights of human consciousness with the mathematical structures underlying reality itself. Alexandria in the 4th and 5th centuries wasn't just the intellectual capital of the ancient world. It was the last great crossroads where streams of ancient knowledge converged, Egyptian temple wisdom that had been cultivating spiritual sciences for millennia, Greek philosophical traditions that sought to understand the cosmos through reason, Persian mysticism, and Eastern contemplative practices brought by traders and scholars from India and beyond. In this extraordinary melting pot, Hypatia inherited and preserved something that modern historians have largely overlooked: her direct connection to the Hermetic tradition. The Hermetic teachings, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes, represented a synthesis of Egyptian priestly wisdom and Greek philosophical inquiry. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts, but practical methods for understanding the fundamental patterns that govern both consciousness and cosmos. When Hypatia taught mathematics, she wasn't simply explaining geometric theorems or astronomical calculations. She was transmitting a sacred science that viewed mathematical relationships as direct reflections of spiritual principles. Consider her famous approach to teaching the ascension of the soul through mathematical contemplation. This wasn't metaphorical language, it was a precise description of how geometric and numerical relationships, could serve as vehicles for expanding consciousness. Her students described experiences during her lessons that sound remarkably similar to the mystical states recorded in Hermetic texts. They spoke of moments when mathematical demonstrations would suddenly reveal universal principles, when the relationships between numbers would illuminate the connections between earthly and celestial phenomena. This directly parallels the core Hermetic principle, as above, so below, the understanding that patterns manifest consistently across all levels of reality. Hypatia's mathematical mysticism embodied this principle completely. When she demonstrated the relationships between geometric forms, she was simultaneously revealing how the same patterns operate in planetary movements, in the structure of consciousness, and in the organization of society itself. Her teaching methodology provides even more evidence of her connection to mystery school traditions. Unlike the typical academic instruction of her era, Hypatia organized her teaching around progressive stages of initiation. Students didn't simply attend lectures, they underwent a carefully structured process where each level of understanding prepared them for deeper revelations. Only when a student had thoroughly integrated one layer of knowledge would she introduce the next level of complexity. This mirrors exactly the initiation practices of Egyptian temples and Hermetic schools, where spiritual development was understood to require gradual preparation of consciousness. Hypatia recognized that certain truths could only be comprehended when the mind had been properly prepared through disciplined study and contemplative practice. Her integration of astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy wasn't arbitrary. It followed the ancient Hermetic understanding that these represent different aspects of a single cosmic science. The movements of celestial bodies, the relationships between numbers, and the principles governing human consciousness were understood as manifestations of identical underlying patterns. This is why her astronomical work was simultaneously spiritual practice and practical calculation. The astrolabe she perfected exemplifies this integration beautifully. Yes, it was an incredibly sophisticated instrument for navigation and astronomical observation. But in Hypatia's hands, it became something more, a meditation device that helped students contemplate the relationship between earthly position and cosmic order. The physical act of adjusting the instrument's components to reflect celestial positions became a form of contemplative practice, aligning the operator's consciousness with the rhythms of the cosmos. Her approach to dialogue and questioning reveals another crucial Hermetic influence. Rather than imposing information on students, she used carefully crafted questions to awaken understanding that already existed within them. This reflects the fundamental Hermetic principle that true knowledge comes from within, not from external authorities. Her famous dialogues weren't just pedagogical techniques, they were applications of the Hermetic understanding that wisdom emerges through the activation of innate capacities rather than the accumulation of external information. The symbols and concepts that appear in later Hermetic texts show clear traces of her influence. Students who studied with her went on to teach others, creating networks of transmission that preserved and developed her insights even as the political climate became increasingly hostile to such teachings. When we examine medieval and Renaissance Hermetic manuscripts, we can identify specific mathematical and philosophical concepts that trace directly back to her innovations. This connects to something crucial about how ancient wisdom traditions actually functioned. They weren't centralized institutions with official doctrines. They were living networks of practitioners who preserved and transmitted knowledge through personal relationships and direct experience. Even during periods of intense persecution, these networks found ways to continue their work, often adapting their methods to changing circumstances while maintaining the essential principles. Understanding Hypatia's connection to the Hermetic tradition transforms our entire perspective on her historical significance. She wasn't an isolated genius, working alone in a hostile environment. She was part of an ancient lineage of wisdom keepers who understood their role as guardians of knowledge that humanity would need for its continued evolution. The tragedy of her assassination becomes even more profound when we recognize what was actually being destroyed. The forces that eliminated her weren't just silencing one brilliant individual, they were severing a chain of transmission that had preserved humanity's most sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness, mathematics, and cosmic order for thousands of years. Yet the story doesn't end with her death. The seeds she planted through her students, the methods she developed, the insights she preserved, these continued to influence seekers of truth across the centuries, emerging in unexpected places and times whenever human consciousness was ready to receive them again. Here's the thing about Hypatia that most people miss entirely. Her greatest gift to humanity wasn't any single mathematical theorem or astronomical observation. It was her method of thinking itself. The way she approached problems, questioned assumptions, and synthesized knowledge from multiple sources created a blueprint for intellectual freedom that remains as revolutionary today as it was 16 centuries ago. Think about how you learned mathematics in school. You memorized formulas, plugged in numbers, got answers. Hypatia's students did something completely different. She taught them mathematical meditation, using geometric contemplation as a tool for developing both razor-sharp logic and deep intuitive insight simultaneously. Her students would spend hours studying the golden ratio in a nautilus shell, not just calculating its numerical value, but contemplating what it revealed about the underlying patterns that govern growth, beauty, and harmony in nature. You can practice this same technique today. Next time you encounter geometric patterns, whether in the spiral of a pine cone, the hexagonal structure of a honeycomb, or the proportions of classical architecture, don't just observe them passively. Ask yourself what principles they embody. What does the efficiency of a hexagon teach you about optimal resource allocation in your own life? What does the Fibonacci sequence appearing in flower petals reveal about how natural systems balance order and creativity? This isn't mystical thinking. It's training your mind to recognize the mathematical principles that operate across all levels of reality. But Hypatia's most dangerous teaching was her systematic method for questioning assumptions. In her time, this meant examining the foundations of Ptolemaic astronomy and Euclidean geometry. Today, it means developing the ability to identify the hidden assumptions that shape your thinking without your awareness. Most people accept beliefs simply because they've heard them repeated often enough. Hypatia taught a different approach. Start with any belief you hold strongly about politics, relationships, success, or human nature. Instead of defending it, trace it back to its source. Did you develop this belief through direct experience and careful reasoning, or did you absorb it from family, media, education, or peer pressure? What evidence would you need to see to change your mind? If you can't imagine any evidence that would shift your perspective, you're dealing with dogma, not knowledge. This process becomes particularly powerful when you apply it to beliefs everyone around you shares. Hypatia's students learned to question ideas precisely because they were popular, not despite their popularity. The consensus often represents the lowest common denominator of thinking, not the highest truth available. Her approach to integrative thinking offers another practical method for modern minds. While most people compartmentalize knowledge, keeping science separate from philosophy, mathematics separate from art, personal insights separate from professional skills, Hypatia taught her students to look for patterns that appear across multiple domains. She saw connections between musical harmony and planetary motion, between geometric principles and ethical behavior, between mathematical beauty and spiritual truth. You can develop this capacity by deliberately reading across disciplines. When you learn something in one field, ask yourself where else this principle might apply. The concept of feedback loops appears in psychology, ecology, economics, and systems engineering. Understanding it in one context illuminates all the others. The principle of emergence, where complex systems display properties their individual components lack, shows up in biology, sociology, consciousness studies, and organizational behavior. This cross-pollination of ideas generates insights that remain invisible to specialists trapped within narrow fields. Hypatia's students became polymaths not because they studied everything, but because they learned to recognize the underlying patterns that connect seemingly separate phenomena. Perhaps most practically, Hypatia used mathematics as a tool for understanding life patterns. Modern people can apply mathematical thinking to personal decisions, relationship dynamics, and social situations with remarkable effectiveness. Probability thinking helps you evaluate risks more accurately instead of being swayed by dramatic but unlikely scenarios. Systems thinking reveals how changing one element in a complex situation creates ripple effects throughout the whole system. Consider your relationships through the lens of geometric principles. Triangular dynamics, where three people interact, follow predictable patterns of tension and alliance. Understanding these patterns mathematically helps you navigate family dynamics, workplace politics, and social situations with greater wisdom. Network theory explains why some people seem to effortlessly connect with opportunities while others remain isolated, regardless of their individual talents. But Hypatia's most crucial teaching was developing intellectual courage, the willingness to pursue truth regardless of social pressure or personal comfort. This meant questioning religious authorities in an era when such questions could prove fatal. Today, it means maintaining independent thinking in an age of information warfare, propaganda, and social media manipulation. Intellectual courage requires specific practices. You must be willing to investigate topics that make others uncomfortable, to ask questions that challenge popular narratives, to follow evidence even when it leads to inconvenient conclusions. This doesn't mean becoming contrarian for its own sake. It means developing the inner strength to think for yourself rather than outsourcing your judgment to authorities, experts, or crowds. Hypatia also understood that genuine learning happens in community, but only when that community is dedicated to truth-seeking rather than mutual validation. She created learning environments where people supported each other's intellectual growth by asking challenging questions, offering alternative perspectives, and holding each other accountable for rigorous thinking. You can create or find such communities today. Look for groups where people discuss ideas rather than just sharing opinions, where disagreement is welcomed as an opportunity for deeper understanding rather than treated as personal attack. Learn to have conversations where you listen for insight rather than ammunition, where you build upon others' ideas while maintaining your critical faculties. These ancient methods become especially crucial when navigating modern challenges. Information overload requires the ability to quickly distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources. Hypatia's techniques for tracing ideas back to their foundations help you identify propaganda disguised as news, marketing disguised as education, and ideology disguised as science. The goal isn't just becoming smarter, it's becoming more free. When you master these methods, you stop living according to other people's programming and start operating from your own understanding. You develop the capacity to see through manipulation, think independently under pressure, and make decisions based on evidence rather than emotion or social pressure. This is what they tried to bury when they destroyed Hypatia and her teachings, not just mathematical knowledge, but the methods for intellectual liberation itself. These techniques remain as powerful today as they were in ancient Alexandria, waiting for anyone brave enough to reclaim them. The most remarkable thing about Hypatia's legacy isn't what the authorities managed to destroy, it's what they couldn't. Despite 15 centuries of systematic suppression, her revolutionary approach to knowledge and consciousness has been quietly shaping human development in ways that would astonish you. Think about this. Every time someone refuses to accept "because I said so" as an answer, they're channeling Hypatia's spirit. Every time a scientist combines rigorous analysis with intuitive leaps, they're using her methods. Every educator who prioritizes critical thinking over memorization is walking her path. The authorities buried her name, but they couldn't bury what she represented: the human capacity for independent thought and integrated wisdom. Look at Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, and you'll see Hypatia's fingerprints everywhere. His seamless blending of mathematics, art, anatomy, and engineering wasn't just Renaissance innovation, it was a direct reflection of her holistic approach to knowledge. Da Vinci understood what she taught, that artificial boundaries between disciplines cripple human potential. When he studied water flow to improve his paintings and engineering designs simultaneously, he was applying her principle that all knowledge interconnects. Johannes Kepler took this further. His discovery of planetary motion laws came not through pure mathematical calculation, but through what he called thinking God's thoughts, combining rigorous astronomical data with mystical insight about cosmic harmony. This marriage of analytical precision with intuitive understanding was vintage Hypatia. Kepler even wrote about music of the spheres, echoing her integration of mathematics with deeper metaphysical principles. The scientific revolution itself bears her hidden influence. Galileo's insistence on direct observation over religious authority, Newton's willingness to explore alchemy alongside physics, and Francis Bacon's emphasis on questioning established knowledge, all reflect her core teaching that truth emerges through independent investigation, not institutional decree. But here's where it gets really interesting. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire explicitly championed her as a martyr for reason against religious fanaticism. Mary Wollstonecraft, writing A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, drew directly on Hypatia's example to argue that women's intellectual capabilities had been systematically suppressed by patriarchal institutions. These weren't just historical references, they were strategic invocations of her legacy to support contemporary battles for intellectual freedom. Modern educational philosophy has been quietly rediscovering her methods for decades. When Maria Montessori developed child-centered learning that respects natural curiosity, she was applying Hypatian principles. When John Dewey advocated experiential learning over rote memorization, he was channeling her approach. Today's most effective educators understand what she knew. Genuine learning happens through guided discovery, not information transfer. Contemporary consciousness research is having its own Hypatian renaissance. Scientists studying meditation and mathematical thinking are finding exactly what she taught, that rigorous analytical work can induce expanded states of awareness. Researchers at institutions like Stanford and MIT are documenting how deep mathematical contemplation activates the same brain regions associated with mystical experiences. They're scientifically validating her integration of rational analysis with consciousness development. Systems theory and complexity. Science represent, perhaps, her most profound modern vindication. When scientists study emergent properties in complex systems, how simple mathematical rules create intricate patterns in nature, they're exploring territory she mapped centuries ago. Her understanding that mathematical principles underlie both physical phenomena and consciousness itself is now cutting-edge science. Ecological thinking has embraced her holistic worldview entirely. The recognition that environmental problems require interdisciplinary solutions, combining hard science with ethical philosophy and practical wisdom, is pure Hypatian methodology. Climate scientists who study atmospheric chemistry while advocating for social change are following her model of engaged scholarship. In our current information warfare environment, her teachings become even more relevant. Every technique she developed for distinguishing truth from manipulation, examining sources, questioning motives, following logical chains, testing claims against experience. These are exactly the skills we need to navigate propaganda and misinformation. She understood that intellectual independence requires both analytical tools and the courage to use them. Her influence on contemporary women in STEM fields is particularly powerful. When mathematicians like Katherine Johnson calculated spacecraft trajectories despite institutional racism and sexism, they embodied Hypatia's refusal to be silenced. When scientists like Barbara McClintock pursued genetic research that contradicted established theories, they channeled her commitment to truth over conformity. Today's women breaking barriers in technology, engineering, and physics often cite her as inspiration, not just as a historical figure, but as proof that intellectual excellence transcends social limitations. Modern personal development movements are rediscovering her integration of contemplative practice with analytical thinking. Programs that combine meditation with problem-solving or mindfulness with critical thinking are essentially updating her ancient curriculum for contemporary needs. The recognition that developing consciousness enhances rather than diminishes rational capabilities is becoming mainstream wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, her story provides a roadmap for intellectual resistance in our current era. She faced the same challenge we do, powerful institutions demanding conformity to profitable lies. Her response, maintaining intellectual integrity while building communities of independent thinkers, offers a proven strategy for our times. Understanding her legacy empowers you to recognize when your thinking is being manipulated and provides tools for developing genuine intellectual independence. Her vision of education as consciousness, liberation rather than workforce preparation offers an alternative to systems designed to produce compliant consumers rather than free-thinking humans. The choice she faced is the same one confronting you right now. Accept the limitations others impose on your thinking, or develop the intellectual courage to seek truth independently. Her legacy lives on every time someone chooses inquiry over dogma, integration over fragmentation, and authentic wisdom over comfortable illusion. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."